Hi, it's Cassidy Elaine, the founder of Embryo Advocates. Thank you so much for joining us to listen to this episode of the podcast today. I wanted to give you a little note about today's episode. When I went to record this podcast episode, my connection to Wi-Fi was a little bit hesitant, so I did have to re-record one section at the very end of the podcast. I kept the same general thoughts I was discussing with Dr. Moreno, but I want you to know you'll hear a little shift in the audio towards the end of this episode. And that was necessary because, unfortunately, a whole clip cut out because of our Wi-Fi coverage. So I wanted to make sure you could still hear the whole message, and that's why you're going to hear the audio sounding a little bit different in one part of this episode. Thank you again for being willing to listen in, and I pray that this episode would help you to reflect on the value of every human life. Your life is valuable, God made you for a purpose, and the world is better with you in it. Every single child who comes to exist is an absolutely incredible gift made in the image of God, and all of us matter. So, as we reflect on the history of abortion, I hope that we look at really a very gruesome history, both of infanticide and abortion, and we reflect on the value of every human, that no matter if a child is considered wanted or unwanted by their parents, we are all valuable before God, and we all deserve protection from violence. Without further ado, here's today's episode. Welcome to this episode of the Embryo Advocates podcast. I'm honored today to be joined by Dr. Paul Moreno, who is a professor of history at Hillsdale College. Dr. Moreno, thank you so much for being here. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your professional background in teaching history?
Yes, my field is U.S. history generally and American constitutional history in particular. So, because of Roe versus Wade and the abortion issue in American constitutional history, that got me. I've been talking about that issue a lot in my classes. And one year, a student asked if I would do a one credit course just focusing on Roe versus Wade and the abortion issue. So I did that a couple of years ago, and I read a lot about the history of abortion. And that's really one of the most interesting parts of the recent Supreme Court reconsideration of the issue is that in Roe versus Wade, the court really based its decision on a very erroneous history of the common law of abortion in America and all that. And a wonderful law professor named Robert Della Penna wrote an enormous book called Dispelling the Myths of Abortion History. And he became my guide to this course I did just about the history. So I'm a very pro-life myself, but really it was the affront to the historical truth of the matter that got me to teach this course.
That's wonderful. And it is such an important course since our understanding of abortion is very skewed. Just like you were mentioning, many people don't know that Roe versus Wade was decided on faulty history. When all the people gathered, for the Roe case, a big part of what the pro-abortion side brought was they claimed that abortion has always been women's secret. They've always had lots and lots and lots of abortions, and they just don't
Hmm.
tell anyone, and you just don't know about it because that's their secret, and they hid it. But then, just as you were mentioning, Dr. Joseph Della Pena wrote this very interesting book because he was like, well, something seems off about that. And he's a very interesting author. When I picked up that book and I read the introduction, I found out that he is not necessarily completely pro-life. He's like partly against abortion, but not completely, which makes him a very interesting author to read because he isn't coming at it with maybe the same biases I come at it, like, oh, yes, let's be against abortion. He's actually kind of like on the middle of the issue in some ways, but just wanted to read up on everything he could find about the history of abortion. And so, yeah, very fascinating resource for anyone who's listening and wants to read that book. It's not one I've been able to finish yet. I've only gotten about 200 pages in. It's about a 1,200-page book, but very fascinating. I'm glad you've had a chance to go deep in that. And so, Dr. Moreno, as people consider the issue of abortion, what would you say was the very first country to ever legalize abortion? And what led up to that? Why did the first country, when did they came to that decision? Was it because of the sexual revolution like it really was in the West?
Yeah, the Soviet Union legalized abortion in 1920, and there were a lot of American sort of communists or proto-communists who were in favor, sort of leading the movement towards legalizing both contraception and abortion. And the Soviets were the first country that had sort of an experiment in that, it was rooted in their belief that the family is simply a bourgeois institution, and women needed to be liberated as much as the working class and all that. And it turned out to be a social disaster. There's a very interesting sociologist named Petirim Sorokin who's written a lot about this subject, about the Soviet experiment in legalized abortion. And by the 1930s, they had reversed course and actually were trying to promote fertility because they thought that the state needed more bodies. And you can see sort of totalitarian countries like China going either way on that point. Japan, after World War II, was probably the next country that adopted liberal abortion laws for lots of reasons. The aftermath of the atomic bombing and their fear about sort of the genetic consequences of that, the American occupation forces in Japan. So there were lots of reasons why different countries have changed their laws in the 20th century. But Great Britain adopted a liberal abortion statute in 1967, just before Roe versus Wade, and at the moment when a lot of American states were beginning to liberalize their abortion laws. But for the most part, it was a 1960s post-World War II phenomenon.
Our world has been so impacted by abortion. And I think most people who are pro-life really only know about the West. We know about Roe versus Wade, the very famous case, but we don't know that the USSR really led the way in 1920. They were the first ones. And as you're sharing about those facts about that very first country, something that really stands out to me is you're talking about how it seems like the devaluation of the family was like the first step to end up destroying the most vulnerable members of the family,
Mhm.
the children. So when they started in, the Soviet society with the communist ideas that family is oppressive to women. This is something we need to abolish the whole family. We need to, drive people to see work as their only purpose for existing. This is this big important thing, and we had to have the revolution. When that mindset was really applied into the law, then they legalized abortion. And what I have understood, you'll have to tell me if I'm right about this or wrong, Dr. Moreno, but what I've understood is that once they legalized abortion and they had like more liberal sexual attitudes in the culture, and they began to have legal abortion, they started to depend on it in a way. It's like they almost became like an early adopter of the sexual revolution. And then when they tried to ban abortion, it was extremely difficult because there wasn't a very healthy understanding of the family and its value, or why children matter at all, because there just had been such a breakdown in the ideology. Does that seem like that's true for the USSR at that time?
Yeah, and for totalitarian societies that would view all of these questions as simply what is good for the state. Part of the historical claims that were made in Roe versus Wade was that the ancient Greeks and Romans, really everyone before sort of the Judeo-Christian tradition began to become dominant in the West, were perfectly fine about abortion and infanticide and homosexuality and all these other sorts of things. But if you look at the Spartans and the Athenians, they looked upon abortion not as an individual right, but as a positive obligation that you had if you had a defective child, a child that wasn't going to be any service to the state. You had a duty to kill that child. So it really wasn't about individual rights at all. It was about what the state can demand of its citizens.
Absolutely. And when it was those early countries talking about how they might try to force people into having an abortion, like for the sake of the state, back then it was like they would practice infanticide, right? Like
Mhm.
because entering women's body cavities was very difficult at this time in history because they did not understand the presence of germs. So a lot of women,
Yeah.
unsurprisingly, died, when they would attempt that
Yep.
um, to go inside the womb. So do you think that maybe part of our understanding as we look at history and the devaluation of the family and of children and of abortion, can we maybe see like what they, so when women were saying, in the Roe versus Wade case, like, wow, this has always happened, it's women's secret. Well, not really. It seems like when someone wanted to dispose of a child, they practiced infanticide, not
Mhm.
abortion. Does that seem like it's historically accurate?
Oh, absolutely. And again, Della Penna makes that point very clearly. Before probably the late 18th century, and especially in the 19th century when antiseptics and antibiotics and things like that began to become part of medical practice, that surgical abortion became the way to go. It's interesting today with the chemical abortion or the medical the abortion pills. that was really the original, you know, because as you said, the idea of, you're practically committing suicide if you try to have a surgical abortion before the 18th century. And in a way, we've sort of come full circle in that chemical abortion is now, I think, from what I've read, the majority of abortions that take place.
That's right. Yeah. It's so sad because with the advancing of our understanding of medicine and understanding the human body better, we should take better care of the human body. We should take better care of people. And instead, now we're killing more people because we know how to enter women's body cavities or give them various medications. Some of these medications even can have good purposes, like inducing labor in a full-term pregnancy to have a healthy delivery, right? And then instead, these tools are being used to kill a living human being. So this is just such a travesty, and it's such a sad thing that when we look at our point of, and where we are now in the history of things, um, that we can't value human life enough to protect it once we do have these tools, which
Yeah.
should help us save lives, not harm them.
Yeah, the advances of embryology in the 19th, 20th century were just remarkable. Where it was well into the 20th century, a lot of people still believed what's called the quickening doctrine, that the embryo isn't really human, wasn't really alive until about 4 or 5 months into pregnancy. And that's why a lot of the common law rules and a lot of the early statutes distinguish between abortion before and after quickening. It wasn't until I think like the 1820s that scientists really established that, to observe fertilization, that it was sperm and egg conception. And it took a long time before people lost those sort of medieval ideas about fetal development. And in the 20th century, as one of those remarkable things was I was born in 1965, just before the abortion reform movement took place. And Life magazine had this huge spread, the first, intra-uterine depictions of a gestating child. And it could have been me because it was April of 1965 and I was born in August. So at the same time that technology and medical science were clearly revealing that, life begins at conception, there were other interests that were moving in the opposite direction. A lot of people thought that it would have been more in keeping with the trend towards equality and the belief in human dignity and the civil rights movement in the 1960s that unborn children should have joined the list of people who were, protected classes. But instead, it was, sort of the feminist idea of woman's right to choose that became the preferred right.
Right. And it's so sad that since the kind of how the history of feminism unfolded, that it became such a war on children. Because if we believe that someone is oppressed in society, how could it be just to oppress another person? Like if we believed that women needed other rights, like having their own bank account, how could it be just in trying to achieve or secure those certain rights while harming another person by literally thinking it'd be okay to decapitate them and cut off their limbs? Like, how could that fit squarely in a movement that says they care about human rights? Like, I just recently had the honor of having Dr. Carrie Grass on the podcast, who she has just done a lot of research on the history of feminism, and she's found that the early feminists, unfortunately, were not always pro-life. Some of them were pro-choice, and some of them had early forms of abortions. And so it's just sad that many of these ideologies, like you were talking a little bit about communism in the USSR and then feminism, they do have some similarities, feminism and communism, where that they just really struggle to see any value of the family, any value for children. And when we don't value them, we also as a society struggle to protect them. So it's just quite a sad thing. But kind of going back to what you were talking about. So we discussed USSR and then Japan was legalizing abortion. So you're starting to lead up to the era of where Roe versus Wade eventually is going to come on the scene. So after the USSR and after Japan, what were some of the other countries to legalize abortion? And then when did the United States kind of join all of these other global forces legalizing abortion?
Yeah, one of the key cases was in 1938, I think it was, Rex against Bourne, where a British court, a judge, basically told the jury that if they thought that an abortion was justified, in this case, it was a young girl who'd been raped by a bunch of soldiers, and a doctor performed an abortion for the sake of the girl. So, sort of one of the classic examples where even generally pro-life people are willing to make exceptions and allow for infanticide and genetic defects and things like that. So that changed the common law in England, but they didn't get around to enacting a statute until 1967. And in the United States, we're kind of unique in that it was the Supreme Court that did it itself in 1973. And they did so in a way that was much more unlimited. In America, after Roe versus Wade, as it was confirmed in Casey, you pretty much had abortion on demand. Whereas as long as you could find a physician who was willing to perform the abortion and as long as you could pay for it, those were about the only limitations on abortion. So by the end of the 20th century, and I think Professor Della Penna makes this point as well, the most pro-abortion regimes in the United States were like North Korea, the United States, and the People's Republic of China. And that's partly because of the way that the U.S.'s abortion policy was invented by the court rather than by the states, some of which were beginning to liberalize their abortion laws in the late 60s, but others were not, or Congress.
It is shocking to consider the entire Supreme Court, making this sweeping decision to destroy human lives. And a lot of people don't understand the history of Roe versus Wade. I know there was a lot I had to learn about it when I started to research it. Can you help our listeners to understand how this case ever came before the Supreme Court in the first place? Because as you were mentioning, there were a few states starting to legalize abortion on their own, but it wasn't a whole national thing until this case
Mhm.
came before the Supreme Court. So how did that take place?
Yeah, a great book to read is by Clark Forsyth called Abuse of Discretion. I think he was the lead counsel for Americans United for Life that were litigators in the Dobbs case. And he actually came to Hillsdale and gave a guest lecture in my course on the history of abortion. So that's the best sort of story about how the court, went out of its way to grasp this issue when it could have avoided it very easily. Because again, on historical grounds, on constitutional law grounds, besides, my own moral and religious opposition to abortion, Roe versus Wade was a very bad decision for lots of reasons. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she made the argument that, well, she was a feminist, she was in favor of abortion, but she said that Roe versus Wade was unfortunate. As she said, it short-circuited the democratic process. The country was moving in a more, pro-abortion direction. States were beginning to change their laws, and Roe versus Wade, because it was the imposition by, nine justices, seven justices on the court, it sort of delegitimized the democratic basis of abortion. But that's really not true. Some states had begun to liberalize their abortion laws. New York was the lead one. In 1970, they adopted pretty much abortion on demand up to 24 weeks of pregnancy. But after that, it could only be in cases of the mother's life being threatened. California adopted a more liberal abortion law. Ironically enough, it was signed by Ronald Reagan when he was governor of California. And Alaska and Hawaii had also, maybe Washington State also, before Roe versus Wade. Some states were moving in the other direction. My own state of Michigan had a referendum just a couple of weeks before Roe versus Wade, where the people they could amend the Constitution to adopt a New York style liberalized abortion law, and it was defeated very soundly, about 60 to 40. North Dakota also had another vote the other way. So there were political organizations that were mobilizing in the opposite direction to resist the liberalization of abortion laws. The one that it's interesting because most people look at Roe versus Wade and they overlook the companion case, which was Doe versus Bolton, which is a Georgia case. Texas had an old-fashioned, maternal life only abortion law. Georgia's was you could get an abortion for it was called therapeutic purposes. If the mother's life or serious health problems were involved, but you would have to make a case to justify the abortion before a hospital medical commission. And that meant that there were going to be very few abortions that were going to be approved because by the 1960s, there were almost no longer any cases of life endangering indications for abortion. As early as the 1950s, I think it was Alan Guttmacher, who was one of the Guttmacher Institute, one of the lead proponents of liberalized abortion laws, who said, really in the old days, things like high blood pressure and tuberculosis, there were reasons why you could not deal physically with continuing pregnancy. But by the 1950s, those were gone. And the only ones left were psychological or psychiatric indications for abortion. So uh, that's where we had come to by the 1960s, and the court just simply overrode all of those laws. Most people say, well, Roe versus Wade struck down most state abortion laws. It actually struck all of them down. Even New York's, which was the most liberal, was struck down by Roe versus Wade. And the New York legislature had enacted that law by one vote. And its next session, they repealed the law, but that repeal was vetoed by Governor Nelson Rockefeller, and that's how New York's law was saved.
So interesting how all in the same country, so many different directions were being taken on this issue. Clearly, it was not everyone in the United States that wanted
Mhm.
abortion to be legal. There were a lot of pro-life people in the country. And I think as these laws are made, there can be a lot of confusion too for people. So I think that the pro-abortion establishment really loves when people don't understand pregnancy.
Mhm.
So they love to say things like abortion is medically necessary and to even share very, very extreme stories of this mother was septic while she was pregnant and then she had a miscarriage and then she was going to die because of pro-life people. They want to pass these laws that force you to not to have miscarriage care, which is not something that's ever
Mhm.
existed. We've never forced women to continue to have a deceased baby's body in their
Mhm.
body. There's always been miscarriage care as long as the practice of medicine has been capable of that. So people don't understand, even as we talk about these laws, that the pro-life movement is very pro women's health care. We support maternal fetal separation when that's medically necessary to save the mom's life, even when tragically that might be at a gestation that's too early for the baby to make it sometimes. In some of those extreme cases, like women having high blood pressure, because it's ethically different than
Mhm.
intentionally harming the baby. And so I think even as people are listening, I hope people listen in who are pro-choice, right? But if they are pro-choice, they might have that tendency to believe that the pro-life movement doesn't care about women's health problems and that we
Yeah.
want to ban women's health care because that's what the pro-choice movement would kind of how they'd characterize us, that we just want women to die, which being that I'm a woman, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't want to support something that might cause me to die. But
Yeah.
um, yeah,
And
and
cases,
you have many women in your life that you support and want to keep alive, and you wouldn't support laws that would lead them to
yeah.
die.
And in medical ethics for a long time, cases like ectopic pregnancy, where the ovum is fertilized in the fallopian tubes and it's going to kill the mother and the child. That is a justifiable abortion, or uterine cancer, or cases like that. So that's a long tradition. But also, you're absolutely right that the media have distorted this issue and have done so from the beginning. The New York Times depicted Roe versus Wade on the front page, although it was below the fold because Lyndon Johnson had died the same day. As the court allows first trimester abortion, and the totality of Roe versus Wade, that it must allow even third trimester abortions if a woman's mental health is involved. They've gone out of their way to distort how sweeping Roe versus Wade was.
It's such an important thing to emphasize because people do not understand that when we don't define health clearly in these laws and we just make it mental health, they can literally say that if a woman has a small amount of anxiety, a little bit of anxiousness, that is enough ground to intentionally dismember her baby in the
Hmm.
womb. Like, so
Yeah.
these laws, it's very, very important that we achieve full legal protection for children, that we protect their lives, because even if their mother doesn't want them to continue to live, they are still a human being who has a right to be safe. And we don't say that as pro-lifers, like we're not being uncompassionate. We know women face real psychological problems when they're pregnant sometimes. And sometimes because of the amazing medical technology we have, early delivery is possible when the baby makes it to viability. If there's really like a psychological crisis, then the mom can be separated from the baby by the time the baby makes it to viability and can receive neonatal critical care. So there's still an option to treat a situation of actual real psychological crisis in the mother. If really the pregnancy causes that kind of a crisis, there is treatment for that can give both lives a fighting chance. But that's also not something discussed often. So as we're considering these laws in the United States, many people, Dr. Moreno, don't know very much about the people involved in Roe versus Wade. Could you tell us a little bit about the Roe baby? We don't even know that the Roe baby exists, that she's alive. And then some of these attorneys who were pro-choice, that some of whom had never actually had much of a job as an attorney prior to going to the Supreme Court to try to force more abortion into our country.
Yeah. The court at the time, Roe versus Wade was in 1973. So the court was transitioning from the Warren Court, which is very, very liberal court, to a more conservative one under Warren Burger. But still, Roe versus Wade was sort of in the Warren tradition. And it had lots of legal sort of technical defects. One of which was that the Jane Roe in the case, Norma McCorvey, had already given birth. So, in technical legal terms, the case was moot. It really shouldn't, it wasn't a case or controversy that the court should have been considering. Article 3 of the Constitution says the judicial power of the United States shall extend to all cases or controversies. So there has to be a real issue with, parties and some, some outcome that they disagree about. So it was sort of the court colluding to address a public policy issue, a political issue that it really didn't need to. And this is not the first time in Supreme Court history. Dred Scott was like that. The income tax decisions were like that. It was a clear case of the court going out of its sort of legal lane into a political one. And some of the academic world, their response to it, John Hart Ely, for example, he said, well, in my view, I would have written an opinion, I would have written an abortion law very similar to what the court came up with Roe versus Wade, but it's not constitutional law, and it doesn't even pretend to be. So even liberals who were in favor of the policy decision of the court said this decision was, just it wasn't adjudication, it was legislation. That's where the trimester scheme, especially, where Harry Blackmun just sort of invented that and says, here's the Supreme Court is now writing a national abortion code. Here is the way the country is going to regulate abortion. And for decades after that, states would try to get around Roe versus Wade and would try to impose certain restrictions that the court would have to approve or not, very much like a legislature would do. So it was alleged to be a piece of constitutional law, but it really was the justices, imposing their own policy preferences on the country. And Warren Burger, for example, the Chief Justice, there was a leak, very kind of like Dobbs, where a couple of days before the decision came out, Newsweek got wind of what the decision was going to be, and they said, "Oh, this is abortion on demand." And Warren Burger was very sensitive about that point. He said, "No, this is not abortion on demand. We're still allowing the states to impose restrictions." And Berger said, "We can depend upon the ethics of the medical profession to limit abortion to clearly justifiable cases." And that turned out not to be the case at all. It was very naive of him. Berger ended up moving in a more anti-Roe direction by the time that he left the court in 1986. And after the Reagan appointees, especially Justice Scalia, the court was everyone thought was on the verge of overturning Roe versus Wade, but instead they confirmed it in 1992 in the Casey case. So it's a very bad chapter in the history of the Supreme Court. And I think the Roberts Court has done a very good job in just getting this out of the courts, a court, sending it back to the states. Again, I believe life begins at conception, and I believe in the 14th Amendment, a right of the life of unborn children. But I really don't believe that's what the Constitution requires, even though that's what I would like.
Hmm. Yeah, I would take a slightly different perspective from you in that I think that I think enough. Like if we have the 14th Amendment to ban abortion on the national level. And I pray that God would actually ban it on the global level, which obviously would be a lot of work, but nothing that's too hard for God. As you're describing the Supreme Court justices, will you summarize for us which Supreme Court justices were in favor of Roe versus Wade and which voted against it?
There are only two dissenters in the case. William Rehnquist, who was a recently appointed Nixon appointee, and interestingly, Byron White, who was a John F. Kennedy appointee from the early 1960s. And those two continued to be dissenters in the years after that. The rest of them some of them were still FDR appointees. William O. Douglas, for example, was on the court until 1975. But the most interesting thing was from even before Roe versus Wade, from 1969 until the Clinton administration, the Republicans had, I think, 10 vacancies to fill on the Supreme Court. Nixon, For Jimmy Carter didn't have any. He was one Democrat in that period, but there were no vacancies in the period. Reagan and the first President Bush. And it didn't change this or a lot of other constitutional issues either. When Casey reaffirmed Roe in 1992, it was essentially two of the remaining very pro-abortion justices, and then the three who wrote what's known as the joint opinion, Souter, O'Connor, and Kennedy, and two of those were Reagan appointees, and one was a H.W. Bush appointee. So it was really interesting that it wasn't until the George W. Bush and the Trump appointees that you finally began to make a difference. A lot of this was due to the fact that the legal world, the law school world especially, the place where justices come from, had been for so long dominated by progressives that there wasn't much for the Republican presidents to choose from. The Federal Society began to change that, and now on the abortion issue as well as affirmative action, which is another one where the court sort of led the way in imposing liberal social policy, that they've begun to take some steps back from that. The other one would be what people are talking about today, the administrative state, sort of the place of the independent regulatory commissions in the American constitutional system. So it took almost 50 years to begin to build a sort of conservative bench to change the course of the Supreme Court.
Such a long, long labor. My
Mhm.
goodness. I'm so grateful for the people that never gave up during those many years because I think many of the advocates for life and some of them, were working in law or like in your field in history. But then some of them passed away before they ever got to see Roe versus Wade overturned. So I have to imagine that effort to change our world and to change the Supreme Court, like I just can't imagine how tireless they had to be and how extremely difficult all of that was. For our listeners who may not know very much about Norma McCorvey, what can you tell us about this woman that this case was all about? Norma McCorvey was having an unplanned pregnancy. I don't believe it was her first unplanned pregnancy, and
Right.
she was seeking an abortion in Texas. And then she became this woman that we all know so well in the Roe versus Wade case, but most of us know almost nothing about her life.
Yeah, and that the groups that were trying to promote the issue, it used to be called the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws, NARAL, and they changed that to the National Association for Reproductive or something, but they're still in business. And they were, I think, it's pretty clearly they weren't concerned about Norma herself. They were trying to use her as a way to get this issue before the court. So she was sort of a victim, really, of the pro-abortion movement, and she ended up becoming a sort of a convert and became a pro-lifer toward the end of her life. I don't know, and I think it was a similar the Jane Doe in Doe versus Bolton, which was the Georgia companion case about this, had a similar sort of backstory about being manipulated into that decision to challenge the Georgia law.
There have been some different books about Norma McCorvey, and I would be very curious about your perspective on it. I'm trying to remember what the name of the book was. I was trying to look it up briefly here. There's a book that kind of claims that Norma McCorvey, she went back and forth between being
Mm,
pro-life and pro-choice. And obviously, she had an awful lot, just from a spiritual perspective, a lot of spiritual warfare over her life because of being a part of a case that led to over 60 million deaths of babies in the womb. Like, I can't imagine, like, just the torment for someone's soul. If you're for or against abortion, you're in the midst of something very, very, very dark to
mhm.
be at the center of this case. And I'm not sure if I'm right about this, but I want to say that the book might have been The Family Row by Joshua Prager. Have you read that book before?
No, no, haven't. Not
Okay,
familiar with it.
I think in the book, if I'm even correct about that being the book I'm trying to think of, I think in this book he claims that basically that Norma McCorvey had like very severe mental illness, which may be true,
Mm,
and that she practiced like a very like overt sexual lifestyle where she was like obviously having sex outside of marriage. That's what led up to her pregnancy. That became the Roe case, but then also like having like a lesbian lifestyle. And he basically claimed that she had such severe mental illness that people could not tell before she died
mhm.
if she was really pro-life or if she was pro-choice or if she was trying to play the best of each side, or if maybe they like the pro-choice movement wanted something out of her, the pro-life movement wanted something out of her. They claimed it's a little bit difficult for us to know if she was really pro-life or not, or if she had a true transformation. What is your perspective on that? Do you believe that Norma McCorvey, like, if going to her deathbed, that she was pro-life and that
Oh,
she had changed?
I have no idea. What's interesting though is the way in which when the decision came out in 1973, it took a long time. It took a number of years before people realized how extensive the ruling was. New York had begun to, New York was a destination point where the big deal with the New York law in 1970 was you didn't have to be a resident of the state for a particular period before you can get an abortion. So it became sort of a mecca for abortion. Washington, D.C. Was similar because of a Supreme Court decision. And the politics of it are fascinating because people think of the parties today, the Democrats being pro-choice and the Republicans being pro-life, but it wasn't that way in the 1970s. There was arguably more pro-choice sentiment among Republicans than among Democrats. So it took a long time before people realized how extensive the right was. The Southern Baptists, who are the biggest Protestant denomination in the country and considered one of the most conservative, they actually welcomed Roe versus Wade because they thought that anti-abortion laws were a violation of the separation of church and state. They were associated particularly with Catholics, and the Catholic Church was the principal, anti-abortion organization in the early 1970s. And so Roe versus Wade really changed American politics, and it became sort of one of the issues most clearly defining the parties by the end of the 1970s. But if you look at the platforms of the parties in the 1970s, they're kind of evasive about it. John Paul Stevens was the first nominee to the Supreme Court after Roe versus Wade, and in his confirmation hearings, nobody even raised the issue of Roe versus Wade. So, the incidents and details about the particular case, it took really more than a decade for people to begin to sort of put it all together.
So, looking ahead a little bit in history at the Planned Parenthood versus Casey case, what was the purpose of that coming to the Supreme Court, and what should pro-life people know about that case as they build their understanding of history?
Yeah, the predecessor case was 1989, Webster versus Missouri, where the court began to accept more and more state restrictions on abortion. The details in Casey were similar about parental notification. Does a husband need to be required to give his consent to the abortion? 24-hour waiting period, things like that. Things that are very marginal, really weren't going to stop anybody from having an abortion if they really wanted to. But the court seemed to be clearly reconsidering Roe versus Wade. And Justice Scalia, in particular, in 1989, seemed to be on the verge of saying we have to, chuck the whole thing. So most people expected the court to overturn Roe in Casey in 1992, and that was an election year, and the left was really sort of mobilizing that they were going to make, that their sort of central campaign issue. And the surprise was the three justices in the middle, Souter, O'Connor, and Kennedy, decided to uphold what they call the core holding of Roe versus Wade, that there is a constitutional right to abortion, based now, they said, not on the right to privacy, which is a thing that the court tried to use in 1973, but a 14th Amendment right to liberty. It's referred to in common law as substantive due process. And they did away with the trimester scheme and they made the standard viability, although it really doesn't amount to much of a difference. But it really had no impact at all because their insistence, especially that mental health, even in the third trimester, states would have to allow abortion for that. Didn't just sort of change the trajectory of abortion at all. So it was a great setback for the pro-life movement. That it looked like, with the Reagan presidency, especially because by 1980, the Republican Party had become, clearly a pro-life party. They were in favor of a constitutional amendment to protect unborn life, that had failed. And there was a larger, I think, sort of sense of disillusionment among social or religious conservatives that political action since the 1960s really didn't amount to much. And so you got, and I think it was a good thing. in the pro-life movement, saying that we need to, focus less on politics and more about the culture, changing people's attitudes, winning over hearts and minds rather than votes.
There was definitely a lot of work to do in the culture because of the
Mhm.
sexual revolution, but it is sad to think that there was a lot of discouragement on the legal
Mhm.
front for sure. They're like, how are we ever going to change the law? And thank God, even though it looked hopeless at the time, eventually Dobbs versus Jackson was coming. So, can you help us understand what happened between Planned Parenthood versus Casey and Dobbs versus Jackson? Because there was a lot of time. And even when Dobbs was starting to be talked about in pro-life circles before it came, there was like talk about, will it come before the Supreme Court? Will this really make a difference? If is it going to be like dismissed immediately, or could this
Mhm.
really impact Roe, maybe even completely overturn it? It was a very like hopeful conversation, but also seemed kind of far-fetched almost because Roe versus Wade had been around so long that many of us had wondered if we'd get to see the day that it overturned, and thank God we did. But will you just tell us a little bit about that time between Planned Parenthood versus Casey and Dobbs versus Jackson?
Yeah, no, I was shocked when Dobbs came down. I didn't think I would live to see the day where the court would, completely overturn it the way they did. And it was a close thing because everyone says that Chief Justice Roberts was trying to, arrange it so that the court would just, can sort of bend the curve of sort of abortion jurisprudence, but not overturn what is now a 50-year-old precedent altogether. And a lot of people theorize that's the reason for the leak, was that they were trying to sort of keep him from joining the dissenters the way that he had in the first Obamacare case. So there's a lot of sort of inside institutional drama within the Supreme Court about this. But again, it looks very simply like the successful conservative appointees, Justice Thomas and Justice Alito especially, and the new Trump appointees, the fact that Donald Trump, you know, you know, just was so fortunate in having three vacancies to fill in one term of his presidency. It looks like just changes in personnel is what accounted for it. And the Trump, even though he's apparently sort of repudiated it, and he seems to have sort of washed his hands of it and has disowned some of the justices that he appointed. Whereas for people like me, the principal reason I voted for him was he said the most important thing a president does is appoint justices to the Supreme Court. And here's the list of justices that I'm considering. And they were all, sort of approved by the Federalist Society. And that's, I found Trump to be distasteful on a number of levels, but that was the principal issue that brought me and a lot of other people to vote for him. So that, the Scalia, the Mitch McConnell holding the line and not voting, not having a vote for Scalia's successor until after the election. And then, may she rest in peace, but Justice Ginsburg's demise at the end of the Trump administration, being able to fill that seat with Amy Coney Barrett, was just an odd, and again, for the pro-life movement, fortunate sort of concatenation of events.
Thank God for those justices coming
Mhm.
for such time as this, really, right? Like Amy Coney Barrett, I
Yeah.
recall extremely aggressive attitudes in our culture towards her, looking for any way to assassinate her character, and probably true of
Mm.
any of, especially the conservative Supreme Court justices. There tends to be like very intense like persecution of them because of their stances. Will you tell us a little bit about Justice Samuel Alito? Because there's so much that I don't know about him, and he played an absolutely massive role in overturning Roe versus Wade.
Yeah, and again, the contingencies there as well are fascinating because two vacancies opened up in the George W. Bush administration in 2005, 2006. And originally, Justice Roberts was appointed to succeed Sandra Day O'Connor as an associate justice. But then William Rehnquist, the Chief Justice, died, and he got sort of kicked up to that spot. And instead of Alito, it was going to be Harriet Miers. And I remember the conservative, sort of legal world being all up in arms about this, that she was just a crony and that she wasn't really a conservative. And so we got Alito instead. So that was also, because when you consider that, Reagan, from a conservative perspective, Reagan was one for three. You got Scalia, but you also got O'Connor and Kennedy. And the elder Bush was, one for two, where you got Clarence Thomas, but you also got David Souter. And it looks like now, conservatives are thinking that Roberts was, he's sort of squishy, but he came around in the end because I think he saw, there was going to be a majority to overturn Roe versus Wade anyway. So he went along with it, but he sort of wrote a concurring opinion. So the two George W. Bush appointees, did end up making a difference. For the Trump appointees, Gorsuch, because he was replacing Scalia, there wasn't much of a campaign against him because, you're replacing one conservative with another. Kavanaugh was the big one because he was replacing Kennedy, and he was the court. He was the median voter on the court, and thus he ended up getting borked. And Barrett just sort of just she was replacing a liberal, but I think because of the woman issue and because it was sort of toward the end of the Trump administration, there wasn't much of a firestorm about that. So now you have a court that is, pretty reliably, again, there are some movement conservatives who think that just reviewing a book about this called The Last Branch Standing, about the court is really divided equally into three parts. There are three hardcore liberals, three hardcore conservatives, and then Roberts and Kavanaugh and Barrett are institutionalists who are they're conservative, but they don't want to sort of push the court too far. They don't want to appear that the court is a partisan institution, and that's I think very clear in Roberts's case. But at least, and I think, well, Roberts is probably glad at least that Roe versus Wade and abortion is off the court's, radar. They no longer are sort of a lightning rod because of that issue. That's been good for the court.
In 2021, I was doing an internship that took me to Washington, D.C. I had absolutely no idea that so soon Roe versus Wade was going to overturn. And so one day we heard, I want to say that this actually happened later. I feel like it was in May of 2022. I was in Washington, D.C. again, and we heard that pro-choice people were going to go to Justice Samuel Alito's house and try to threaten him, right? Just like you're gonna, stomp around angrily and scream at him until he is intimidated into, having a more pro-abortion conclusion about the case. This poor man, this is not legal, but they're going to do it anyway, right? And so a bunch of pro-life people gathered outside of his home, and we had these signs, and it just said, we support Justice Samuel Alito,
Mhm.
because at this point the leak had occurred, and we saw, all of us heard that Roe versus Wade is overturning as a result, in part because of him. And so it's just very interesting, the persecution that many of
Mhm.
these justices have experienced. And, maybe you would recall this better than I would, but I think it was Justice Kavanaugh, too, who had a man enter his house to attempt to kill him around
Yep.
this time that Roe versus Wade was going to be overturned. And thank God the Secret Service acted. And is that the Secret Service? I think so, right? That
Yep.
protects them. And they acted to protect Justice Kavanaugh, and he was not killed, even though the man was very close to doing so.
Mhm.
So those are the kinds of things that these justices were experiencing while they're going about their private duty of, responding as the court does. Like they respond very privately and then they share it publicly what their conclusions are. And so then we came up to that date. I want to say it was June 24, 2022. Is that accurate? Yes,
Yeah, that was the case, the leak happened earlier, I
in
think
May.
about March or
Mhm.
so.
Oh,
Politico
March. Okay, yeah.
brought it out, and there's still conflicting theories about who's responsible for that. Nobody has been identified, and whether it was the conservatives or the liberals who were most responsible for it. But yeah, I think the fact that and Justice Scalia pointed this out in his many abortion dissents over the years, that one of the reasons why you have people protesting outside of the Supreme Court and all that is that people are looking upon the court now as a political institution rather than a legal one. And I think that the court getting out of the abortion issue is going to help, I think, cool things down so that the justices can have more normal lives.
They really risked their lives, though. There was a
Hmm.
pro-abortion article I saw. It was something like they were trying to open an abortion clinic called Justice Samuel Alito's mom's abortion clinic.
Hmm.
Like that is
No.
how extreme the
Yeah.
pro-abortion groups were.
Yeah.
And there very much was a resurgence of pro-abortion violence around this time as well, where I want to say it was called, was it Jane's Revenge or something? There was
Yes.
some
Yep. Yep.
pro-abortion group, yes, where
Yep.
they were into like just extremely violent behaviors,
Hmm.
threatening violence against anyone, like pro-life people. They were like spray painting pregnancy centers with
Hmm.
threatening messages. That's just kind of where the culture was at that moment
Yeah.
in 2022. So, what occurred in the case Dobbs versus Jackson? What about the case overcame Roe versus Wade and led to it being overruled?
Yeah, the other one was the Shout Your Abortion movement, which
Mhm.
was, pro-abortion people saying, well, we don't have anything to apologize about. Abortion is, the pro-slavery people made this argument before the Civil War. It's a positive good. Bill Clinton, Democratic president, said we want abortion to be safe, legal, but rare, right? And there was, I think that's been uh, you don't hear much of that anymore, but this idea that abortion is something that should be celebrated, that it's a good thing, not a necessary evil. I think in Dobbs, again, the part that appealed to me most as a historian was its rejection of. There are a couple of law review articles by a guy named Cyril Means, who was counsel for the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws, which was very, very shoddy historical account. Basically, the argument being that abortion was not a crime in the common law before the Civil War. It was only in the middle of the 19th century that, for lots of disreputable reasons, uh, the medical profession wanted to remove the role of midwives in managing pregnancy. We were afraid that native-born Protestant women, their fertility rate was declining, and we want to, prevent abortion and contraception. In other words, it really wasn't about protecting the right to life of the unborn child. It was for a lot of other social and economic causes. And Alito, again, based on the work by Professor Della Penna, sort of put that to rest and basically said that there was no sort of tradition and history of abortion as a right in America before Roe versus Wade. In fact, it was, sort of in the opposite direction. And this has given rise to a whole sort of cottage industry of legal analysts who are looking at the sort of history and tradition of abortion in America. And it's going to be a long time, I think, before Della Penna's, I think it's correct view comes to be most widely accepted. So people are still making the argument that there are all these other reasons why abortion was criminalized in the 19th century.
And yet he made such a shocking contribution to the
Mm.
overturning of Roe versus Wade. Because I don't know if Dr. Delpino, I don't think he had the idea that he would be used in Dobbs. I don't think at all he ever probably imagined that that would occur. I think he was trying to correct the history
Yes, yeah,
that
and
was so wrong in Roe
right.
versus Wade. And then little did he know that God was going to use him to help overrule Roe, which was, as you said,
No. And Della Penna, I mean, I've corresponded with, I don't know if his views have changed, but he says in his book that he was pretty much, he was in favor of, first trimester abortion is okay. And most accounts say, well, you're talking there about 95% of abortions, so it's not going to change very much. So it wasn't that he was, a pro-life, life begins at conception sort of movement conservative. He was just affronted at the abuse of history that he saw, that he had to do something, and it's been very beneficial.
it really has. And it's wonderful that there are people like yourself, Dr. Moreno, that have devoted yourself to the study of history and you've decided to really ask what history says instead
Mm,
of how can we manipulate history into
right.
making the case we want, which I think it tells us something about the nature of abortion. If we have to create a lot of lies to promote it, what is it saying about the practice itself? Like history
Right.
doesn't support it, but
Yeah.
also the fact that we have to create a fictitious history in
Hmm.
order to make laws that we feel comfortable ourselves as a society. Oh, look at the fake history of,
Hmm.
this and that happened. And this one woman had her secret abortion in the 1700s that never took place. So it's very interesting that something as, murderous as abortion, it also requires a whole lot of lies.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
again, if you consider that abortion is murder, you shouldn't be surprised that people are going to lie about it. It's in for a dime, in for a dollar.
It's so true. So, Dr. Marino, as you consider the broad history of abortion on the global and the national scale, what would you say are the most important things we can learn from the history of abortion?
Well, I mean, it's our inability to know a lot of the facts and the data about it because this was something that was considered, if not criminal, at least immoral for most of human history. Our ability to understand sort of human vices and failings, it's sort of makes you wonder how much historians can actually know. This is why in the legal world there was the common law rule was the born alive rule. where you really couldn't convict somebody of criminal abortion unless you could prove that the child hadn't died in utero of natural causes. So that the proof of convicting someone for abortion was very, very difficult to meet. And if you look in the 19th and 20th century, it was just sort of a handful of cases where people were convicted of performing abortions. Almost always the convictions came about not because of the unborn child, but because the mother was killed. And these are just some of the problems of proof, of evidence. Again, Delapen is excellent in sort of bringing this sort of stuff to light. So the willingness of people to sort of just face the facts and to sort of consult a very limited evidentiary base. Some of the physicians in the 19th century who were beginning to realize, oh, now we actually do understand that life begins at conception. We need to change the customs of the medical profession. How slow and difficult it is to get people to become aware of some of the facts of human nature is very humbling, I think, as a historian.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Moreno. And I really appreciate and value how you have taken the knowledge that you have and you're using it to educate other people to understand abortion more accurately. Because as the saying goes, I'm sure I'll butcher it and not say it quite right, but if we don't know our history, how are we going to know where we're going?
Mhm.
And most often we don't know where we've been on
Right.
the issue of abortion. We don't know that our world has been plagued, since the 1920s,
Mhm.
starting with the USSR, with this horrible scourge of abortion. When we consider history, we can see that abortion was not always around like some kind of women's secret, as the pro-choice side in Roe versus Wade argued. Since the medical establishment did not know about the importance of hand washing to prevent the transmission of diseases until 1847, women who attempted to have abortions before this discovery typically died right alongside their unborn child from preventable infections. Instead of having an abortion like that could have killed them, women would typically complete their pregnancies that when they didn't want to have this baby, and then they would instead practice infanticide to get rid of the child they considered to be unwanted. Many precious infants were killed through exposure, abandonment, or other kinds of harm because of the faulty ideology around them. Unwantedness is a problem of the adult holding the view that a child should not be accepted. It is not a problem of the nature of the infant described as unwanted. Sometimes we demonize children that are called unwanted. We somehow think they've done something wrong. The unborn child or the infant who are considered to be unwanted are not any less human than any of the rest of us. Someone else's capacity to want us or to not value us, either way, it doesn't give value to us. It doesn't take away our value. We are each human beings who intrinsically have value because God made us. We are all wanted by God and we all deserve protection from violence, either through abortion or infanticide. It is never okay, even if someone doesn't want us. Historically, it was often the Christians of a society who would rescue these quote unquote unwanted infants from exposure. As we look at our modern era and the 73 million abortions that take place around the world every year, we still have a massive problem with children being dehumanized and devalued. Like the Christians of societies of the past who went out to save the devalued infants that would have otherwise died as a result of infanticide, may we today rescue children from the violence of abortion and overcome the faulty ideologies that lead to children being dehumanized and discarded. Dr. Moreno, do you have any final thoughts for our listeners
Well,
on the history of abortion or any books that you recommend for them to check out on this topic?
yeah, just amen to what you just said in conclusion. And again, Robert Della Penna is enormous. I mean, it's everything you want to know about the history. And also Clark Forsythe's book about the Roe case in particular would be my chief recommendations.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marino.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate your knowledge and thank you for teaching about
Hey,
abortion at
thanks.
your school. At the college level. I thought to interview you because your daughter Ruth,
Yes.
who I used to work with, she mentioned to me that while she was in college, I want to say she was majoring in history, if I'm right,
Yep. The politics, political
she
science.
took your class.
Yes.
which political science. Okay, so she's majoring in political
Right.
science. She got to take a class on the history of abortion because
Yeah.
you put all that work together and you offered that. And that's not common for people to be able to find a class like that, and especially not one that looks at the honest history
Mhm.
of our world and of our nation and where we've been. So thank you for putting all that together and for all the work you've done so we could understand this better.
Thank you for having me.